He kept count. 23 times. Not 24. Not a vague a few. Not, she was young, and it was complicated. No. Clint Eastwood, the man who built his entire legend on control, on power, on resolve, stood in the dim quiet of a press room months after a brutal double homicide and said, without blinking, "He slept with my daughter 23 times. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates." And yet, that wasn't even the headline. Because just days earlier, Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle, were found in their home, stabbed to death, violently, repeatedly, by their own son. And now, the man standing in front of the cameras was Clint Eastwood. Not to mourn, not to offer condolences, but to unearth something darker than grief. Something he'd carried for years. Why now? Why speak now, after two people are dead and a third is in custody? Is this revenge? Or is it the truth finally finding daylight? Because if what Eastwood says is even partly true, this story doesn't begin with a murder. It begins with a betrayal. A private one. A silent one. One he claims tore through his family, his sense of fatherhood, and what he calls the last thread of trust one ever had in that man. And here's the thing. This isn't just Hollywood drama. This is about power. It's about proximity, influence, silence. It's about what happens when the people who build our myths, our feel-good movies, our moral messages, our political causes, are also the ones who manipulate, seduce, and destroy in the shadows. So the question tonight isn't, why did Nick Reiner kill his parents? The question is, what had already died, long before the knife ever touched skin? We'll get there. But let's not skip ahead. Because buried beneath the blood and headlines is something deeper, something quieter. Something you'll only understand if we start at the very beginning. Let's rewind. Let's go back before the screams, before the sirens, before the public statement that lit the internet on fire. To the years when Clint Eastwood's youngest daughter was still just a quiet shadow behind a legendary father's image. She wasn't a starlet. She wasn't ambitious. She didn't want fame. She wanted distance. Privacy. But in Hollywood, privacy is weakness. And weakness is an invitation. So she avoided the red carpets, sure. She declined the invitations, the magazine shoots, the nepotistic roles. But she couldn't avoid Rob Reiner. No one really could. He wasn't just an actor, or a director, or even just a loud voice in politics. Rob Reiner was infrastructure. He was family man personified. The guy who directed The Princess Bride, who told stories about fatherhood, justice, childhood wonder. He was safe, until he wasn't. According to Clint, it began with a dinner. A private one, intimate, just industry friends. A few laughs, a few glasses of wine. The kind of night no one photographs because it's not public enough to matter. But it mattered, because after that night, Clint says, something shifted. She got quieter, more withdrawn. And then one day, she told him, just 4 words. He's been with me. Not, we're in love. Not, it's complicated. Not even, I made a mistake. Just, he's been with me. And Clint Eastwood, the man who stared down 1,000 villains on screen, says he froze. Because the man she was talking about was his friend, his colleague, the man whose political causes he didn't always agree with, but whom he trusted. Enough to call him a brother in arms when they'd shared war stories from the 80s. And more importantly, this man was married, had been for decades. Michelle Reiner, his wife, had stood beside him at gala after gala. She'd sat next to Clint and his daughter at fundraisers. She was grace, stillness, until the stillness broke. Because Clint didn't react right away. He waited, listened, asked questions. And when the pieces clicked into place, when he finally saw how long it had been going on, he counted. 23 times. That's how many she admitted. That's how many he couldn't forget. But he didn't go to the press. He didn't confront Reiner with fists. Instead, he did something far more disturbing. He kept it inside. For years. Let it rot there. And maybe that's why the moment he spoke out, finally, publicly, after the Reiners were dead, felt like an exorcism more than a confession. Because he wasn't trying to hurt Rob. He was trying to explain why he was already broken. And maybe that's why it matters now. Because if a man like Clint Eastwood, stoic, severe, impossible to shake, can be undone by betrayal, what about the rest of us? What happens when a father's silence becomes a son's rage? Because while Clint stewed quietly in his own darkness, Nick Reiner, the son of Rob and Michelle, was battling his own demons. Depression, addiction, rehabilitation, resentment, and over time, whispers. Whispers that his father wasn't the man he presented to the world, that there were secrets, that someone had been hurt, not by violence, but by power, emotional power. And somewhere along the line, those whispers turned into rage. And that rage, well, you know where it ended. But you don't know how it started. You don't know what Nick saw, what he overheard, what he read, what he connected late one night, sitting alone in his father's study. Was it guilt? Jealousy? Was it revenge? Or was it something worse? That's what we're here to unpack. Because this isn't a story about a murder-suicide. It's a story about power misused, love distorted, loyalties broken, and the haunting possibility that none of this was ever about a single night of violence, but about years of secrets left to fester in silence. The kind of silence that lives in family portraits, that hides behind industry smiles, the kind that looks like calm until it isn't. And so the question we open with, the one that Clint Eastwood never thought he'd ask publicly, but finally had to, remains. What do you do when the man who made the world laugh, taught it to believe in fairy tales, and stood beside you in battle, turns out to be the man who took your daughter's innocence? Over and over again, do you stay silent? Do you protect him? Or do you wait for the day the house collapses in on itself? Because that day came, and now we're left to ask, was the collapse inevitable? Or was it planned? What Clint Eastwood knew, what Michelle Reiner suspected, what Nick Reiner couldn't live with. These aren't just puzzle pieces, they're landmines. And over the next hour, we're going to step through them, one by one. But fair warning, once we start digging, we may not like what we find. Because the next piece, buried in the final voicemail Clint ever received from his daughter, was never meant to be heard. But we're going to hear it. And what comes after will change everything. They were dead before the neighbors even realized the screaming had stopped. That's the most chilling part. Not the sound of sirens echoing through Beverly Hills. Not the flashing lights bouncing off the tall hedges that lined the Reiner estate. But the silence after. And in that silence, something sank in. Not just that Rob and Michelle Reiner were gone, but that whatever had destroyed them had started long before that final, bloody night. The police arrived at 9:42 p.m. The call had come from inside the house, sort of. It was a 911 alert from a smart device, triggered not by a human voice, but by a sudden, violent impact. The kind that activates fall detection, audio spike warnings, emergency AI. The call didn't say a word. It didn't need to. When responders entered the house, they didn't find a struggle. They found an aftermath. 2 bodies. Stab wounds, multiple. Defensive injuries on Michelle's hands. Rob's throat, cut deeper than necessary. That was the phrase used in the early internal report. More than necessary. Let that sit for a moment. What makes a wound more than necessary? Anger? Rage? A message? Or something even less rational? Something that goes beyond justice or punishment? Something like release. Nick Reiner was found sitting in the backyard. He was barefoot, shirtless, blood on his arms, his father's watch on his wrist. And when they approached, he said one thing. I didn't think it would feel like this. That's it. Not denial. Not panic. Not even remorse. Just reflection. And yet, the media the next morning played it simple. Mental breakdown. History of depression. Unstable son of beloved director. They painted it clean. A family tragedy. Private pain that spilled too far. And Clint Eastwood, he watched it all in silence. But here's what no one noticed in those first 48 hours. Clint had been to that house. Not just years ago, during Hollywood dinner parties or private screenings. But recently, 2 weeks before the murders, he'd stood in that very living room. Not as a friend, not as a guest, but as a man trying to bury something. Trying, maybe, to forgive. We'll get there. But on that night, the night of the murder, Clint was alone, in Carmel, miles away from it all, until his phone rang. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the press. It was a burner number. And the voice on the other end was shaking. She didn't say her name. She didn't have to. Because Clint had heard that kind of breath before. The kind of breath you only have when you're standing next to something monstrous. She told me. The voice said. I found the letters. That's all. That's all he remembers. Then the line went dead. Let's pause for a second. Because it's easy to rush to judgment when a celebrity dies, especially like this. We want the clean narrative. The troubled son. The distant father. The loving mother caught in the middle. But here's what makes this story different. The people involved were not just public figures. They were architects of perception. Rob Reiner didn't just make movies. He made America feel like home again in the 80s and 90s. He crafted nostalgia like it was a science. He helped build the political messaging machine behind multiple Democratic campaigns. He understood, deeply, how to shape reality, how to make us feel like we knew him, loved him, trusted him. That matters. Because when someone like that is killed, not by a stranger, but by his son, the question shifts. It becomes not what happened, but what was he hiding? And more importantly, who else knew? Clint Eastwood says he knew. Not everything. Not the ending. But enough. Enough to feel the rot beneath the foundation. He'd sensed it when his daughter started pulling away. He'd felt it in the conversations that suddenly stopped. He'd seen it in the way Michelle Reiner avoided his eyes at the last charity event they both attended. And most haunting of all, he claims he saw it in Nick. The way Nick would look at him. Like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. Like he was waiting for Clint to go first. So when the news broke that night, Clint didn't speak. Not publicly. He watched. He read between the lines. And 2 days later, he drove to Los Angeles, not to grieve, but to confirm something. He didn't say what. But friends close to him remember the look. Not grief. Not shock. Certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when something you feared finally happens. When you realize you weren't paranoid. You were just early. But what was he certain of? That's the question, isn't it? Because if Clint Eastwood is to be believed, the murders weren't just spontaneous violence from a broken mind. They were the violent conclusion of a story no one wanted to believe was real. A story that began with a man crossing boundaries, with a daughter too afraid to speak, and a father who, by his own admission, waited too long to act. The guilt is visible. You can see it in Clint's interviews. Hear it in his pauses. He doesn't want sympathy. He wants clarity. He wants people to understand that this didn't happen because of one bad night. It happened because of 23. And because those 23 nights were buried until they rotted. But what does that even mean? What were the letters? What did Nick find? And why did Michelle Reiner, a woman who once campaigned for domestic abuse victims, stay silent about what her husband allegedly did? These are not just salacious questions. They are essential ones. Because this isn't about reputation anymore. This is about rot. Cultural rot. Private rot. The kind that sits behind smiles and dinner parties and fundraiser galas. The kind that only reveals itself when someone bleeds. And on that night, 2 people bled. But one of them, Nick, survived. He's in custody now. No bail. Awaiting psychiatric evaluation. Some say he'll never stand trial. Others say he's already told the full story to investigators, and that the real reckoning hasn't even begun. Because if that story includes Clint's daughter, if it includes names we haven't yet heard, then the night of the murder wasn't the climax. It was just the first crack in a wall that's about to fall. And the next sound you'll hear might be the crash. Here's something odd. The coroner's report, sealed for weeks before a leak brought it to daylight, included one peculiar note, easily missed by someone scanning for the usual: cause of death, time of death, presence of substances. But there it was, almost buried. Michelle Reiner suffered 4 wounds prior to the fatal blow. 3 consistent with defensive movements. 1 inconsistent. What does inconsistent mean in this context? According to one former forensics analyst, who requested anonymity, it means someone might have hesitated. As in, the blade was raised, but stopped. As in, whoever did this might have looked her in the eye before delivering the final cut. And froze. Not out of mercy, out of conflict. That kind of hesitation? That's not rage. It's something deeper. Something torn between horror and obligation. So let's ask the hard question. What did Michelle know? Because we like simple stories, like the one where Michelle was just collateral damage, the innocent wife, killed simply because she was there. But what if she wasn't just there? What if she knew something? Clint Eastwood suggests as much. In a brief but jarring quote during his first public comment, he said this: "She was complicit in silence. And silence can be fatal." It was one of the few times he ever mentioned Michelle by name. And he didn't say it with venom. He said it with exhaustion, like someone who had hoped, maybe even begged, for her to speak up and watched her choose not to. But let's get back to Nick. Because that night, as police placed him in cuffs, he didn't resist. He didn't scream. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He said something else. Over and over. It was already over. I just ended it. Again, what does that mean? It was already over. The family? The illusion? Or maybe the lie that his father was a man worth protecting? According to insiders, Nick had grown increasingly isolated in the months leading up to the killings. He'd stopped showing up to industry events. He'd refused to attend his father's recent birthday gala. And, according to a former friend, he'd been obsessively watching old tapes. Not movies. Home videos. Hours of them. Including ones Clint Eastwood didn't know still existed. Because back in the early 2000s, the Reiners and the Eastwoods weren't just acquaintances.